Never in the history of armoured warfare has a weapon been such a shock to the enemy and dissolved the ideas of its own invincibility. In this episode, I will cover mainly the three main factories that produced the T34 up until early 1943, these being the Kharkov Locomotive Works, the KHPZ/Nazingi Tagil 183, Stalingrad Tractor Factory, STZ 264, and Krasnoye-Samovo, Gorky 112. I would like to stress that the history of the T34 is long and complex. Many factory changes go undocumented in English, and I am only a T34 enthusiast. I will list my reference material at the end. I would like to thank the T34 Interest Group for your help with some of the facts and photos provided. But before we go into the factories, let's take a look at how the T34 started life. In 1937, the Red Army had assigned engineer Mikhail Koshkin to lead the new design team to design a replacement for the BT tanks at the Kharkov Comintern locomotive plant, the KHPZ. The prototype tank, designed A20, had 20mm thick armour, a 45mm gun, and the new model V234 engine in a V12 configuration. It also had an 8x6 wheel convertible drive similar to the BT tanks, which allowed it to run on wheels without caterpillar tracks. After battlefield reports from Spain and against the Japanese, Koshkin convinced the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to let him develop a second prototype, a more heavily armed and armoured universal tank which reflected the lessons learnt and could replace both the T-26 and BT tanks. Koshkin named the second prototype A32 after its 32mm frontal armour. It had an L10 76.2mm gun and the same model V234 diesel. The new design omitted the wheel track convertible configuration in favour of tracks only. Both were tested in field trials at Kubinka in 1939, with the heavier A32 proving to be as mobile as the A20. A still heavier version of the A32 with 45mm of frontal armour, wider tracks and a new L11 76.2mm gun was designed. This was called the A34. This was tested extensively and was accepted for production at the Kharkov plant 183. The first production T34s from 183 were near identical to the A34 prototype. The biggest differences were that the front glacis plate was now made in 3 parts, rather than being made of one piece and being bent from the nose. The driver's hatch now had a lip to stop spalls from entering the tank, and the radio was moved from the turret to the hull next to the machine gunner. 453 T-34s were rolled out of 183 fielded with the L11 gun, before production switched to the far improved F-34 gun. This had a higher shell velocity and was more accurate than the L11 gun. Tanks issued with the L11 gun were fitted with either a welded turret similar to the prototype, but some were fitted with a cast turret. Tanks built with the L11 gun are known as T34-76 Model 1940. The first F-34 gunned T-34s were identical to the L11 gun tank's hull in exterior. Internally, the shell stowage was different. After the war broke out, the T-34 at 183 started to go through design changes. The first change was the addition of another periscope in the turret, new tow hooks, and new simplified stowage bins in the left fender. Soon, more improvements were added to the design. Complaints at the track grip and loudness caused 183 to design a new type of track. This was the V-Type 41 track. Also, a new driver's hatch was introduced. This was a vast improvement on the old style hatch, with 2 periscopes under armoured lids. Also, new welded turrets were introduced which were wider at the rear. It had 8 bolts to remove the plate to access the gun for maintenance. The easiest way to tell the difference between an 8-bolt Kharkov built and an 8-bolt Stalingrad built is whether the road wheels are solid. Solid road wheels means 183. In October 1941, Kharkov was evacuated and the plant moved to Nizhny Tagil. The new factory retained the original factory number 183 and started producing tanks brought from supplies from Kharkov. It was in April that the next and most important changes were made. Both the simplified hull and hexagonal turret were introduced in early 1942. The earliest examples of the hexagonal turrets still had square transmission access hatches at the rear of the tank. Later, the 7-bolt design was copied from the design changes made at 112 Gorky. The turret was produced from April 1942 to early 1944. A turret in the initial production batch, or with a soft edge, are known as T34-76 model 1942 hexagonal. Then in November-December 1942, the hard edge hexagonal was introduced. The last major change was the wheels. As of the model 1942, solid road wheels without rubber were introduced. However, due to the harmonics caused by running at full speed, rubber wheels were introduced onto the first and fifth wheels. Tanks at the end of the production were also equipped with a command coupler. All tanks built with hard edge and command coupler are known as T34-76 model 1943. On the 25th of June 1941, the Council of the People's Commissars of the USSR and the Central Committee of the Communist Party issued a joint resolution to increase production of the T-34, KVs and T-50s. On July 1st, Resolution 1SS was passed, authorising the Krasnoye Samovo to start producing the T-34. The initial production run was made from kits supplied by Factory 183. These would have been standard late production model 1941 hulls. They were built with cast turrets, with the later driver's hatch and new tow hooks. Very soon after production started, the turret hatch was simplified as seen here. Very soon after production started, 122 modified the design to better suit the production equipment they had at Krasnoye Samovo, as they were still a shipyard. The first major change was the simplification of the rear hull. The old square transmission hatch was retained, but a new rear hull with a 90-degree angle between the rear hull plate and the lower rear hull plate was made. It is unknown how many were made, however there is only one photo that I could find. Next was the addition of the 4-bolt round transmission hatch. Also at around this point, the new interlocking front hull plate was introduced. 112, STZ and 183 were ordered to increase the armour thickness on the T-34 to 60mm in late 1941. The first turret with add-on armour was produced by 112 on February 21st, and the first hull with additional armour was produced on February 25th. The armour slowly evolved over time to simplify production. The additional armour was removed from production in mid-1942. 112 was the first to install handlebars. They appeared in spring 1942. In 1941, 112 produced 173, some sources say 161 T-34s. Due to the shortage of V2 engines, all of these T-34s were issued with the old M17 petrol engine. 364 T-34s from January to March 1942 were also rolled out with M17 engines. In March 1942, 112 started experimenting with turrets to omit the rear access in the turret, because as the machine gun was fired it created harmonics that damaged the integrity of the turret. They made a turret without an access port in the rear, changing it to a jack system to lift the turret and remove the gun thusly. It was accepted for production. Also, in 1942, small pieces of armour were attached to protect the turret ring. Later, the 7-bolt transmission hatch was introduced. The T34 in this configuration was produced into mid-1943. Then 112 moved onto hexagonal turreted T34s. It is very difficult to define the types of T34 as there was so much change in a short amount of time. However, the standard method appears to be that tanks built at 112 without handholds are known as T34-76 model 1941, whereas tanks built with handrails are T34-76 model 1942. The Stalingrad tractor factory started making T34s in early 1941, before the war broke out. Stalingrad was an entire city devoted to the production of the tank, with internal assemblies and subcontractors. On the 25th of June 1941, the Council of the People's Commissars of the USSR and the Central Committee of the Communist Party issued a joint resolution to increase the production of T-34s in the third and fourth quarter of 1941. Before June 22, 1941, STZ had produced 294 T-34s, which would have looked almost identical to the Kharkov tanks. STZ built T-34s with cast and welded turrets. The first major change to the STZ-built T-34s was the solid road wheels with internal shock absorbers and no rubber. This was due to the lack of rubber in late 1941. STZ would follow Kharkov with most of the design changes, so as 183 changed the tow hooks and driver's hatches, so would STZ. This included the new 8-bolt weld turrets. The next big change was the interlocking glacis and rear plate, then followed was changes to the turret. The turret cheeks were simplified. Then the rear turret had the 8 bolts omitted. In addition, the gun replicator armour was simplified by the Barakadi gun factory. STZ made the most distinctive changes throughout the production, and the easiest way to spot an STZ is through the wheels. The T-34 was stopped being produced at STZ in October 1942, only when the Germans were at the gates of the factory. The tanks built at Stalingrad, especially the later tanks, were not known for their good craftsmanship. However, they filled a gap that was sorely needed. The T-34 built at Stalingrad were put straight onto trains and offloaded at Gumrak up until August, when the Germans captured the airfield. The T-34-76 model 1941s are distinguished by either the 8-bolt early turret or the gun replicator. T-34-76 model 1942s are distinguished by the late STZ turret or the gun replicator armour. These 3 factories were not the only factories to produce the T-34-76. Omsk, Sverdlovsk and Chereblinsk also produced T-34-76s from 1943. Chereblinsk's T-34s were very unusual for having a drop-forged turret. There is one more tank I would like to talk about. At 183, 20 T-34 exterminator tanks were released. These were fielded with a 57mm anti-tank gun. There is only one tank photographically documented. They were used in the defence of Moscow, and it is claimed that they scored numerous kills. The T-34 only made up less than 20% of the Red Army strength in 1941, and during the Stalingrad campaign this number rose to only 35%. It was only at the Battle of Kursk that the Red Army's strength was up to 60% T-34. However, with the introduction of the new Panther and Tiger, the T-34-76 soon fell out of favour. A new T-34 was made, the T-34-85, but that is another story. The almost fantasized German reaction to the weapon is noteworthy, as both German and Russian soldiers came to know the German Pak-36 as the door knocker, as it was unable to penetrate armour of the T-34. However, countless T-34s were lost due to mechanical failure, ammunition expenditure or fuel expenditure. The T-34 is a legend, and it deserves that legendary status. It is argued that if the T-34 had not been produced, the Red Army would have lost. It seems daft that then, in 1941, there was already a replacement on the drawing board, this being the T-34M, a tank that never saw the light of day, however some components were manufactured. the T34 saved Russia, and therefore the world. We should be thankful.